And it is time. So, I start and let uh, the class assemble as it will. Uh, the last uh, week or so, when I put a new item on the syllabus, Udipta thought that he will improve on that. And aside from the piece by de Cleef, which I took from the Oxford Handbook, he now also recommended a piece with the same title by Rogers Brubaker on nationalism and populism. And it's an extremely good piece. I think that the Clef is a good piece too. And the two together really indicate to some important extent the kind of discussion we need to have, especially on this important topic, because almost no one imagines that the relationship of nationalism and populism is not in a central place for those who are interested in this political phenomenon. Uh, Indeed, there are uh, there are people who consider the really important version of populism today to be a national populism or populist nationalism. If you read the same Constellations volume in which I published a piece on socialism, Federico Finkelstein's piece, you will see that he he even is willing to put Chavez under the same heading, something I wouldn't do. I mean, I accept the idea that 21st century socialism was not just a meaningless window dressing. It was to some extent a motivating dimension for probably not so much Chavez, but his circle, and even perhaps for him. So nationalism and populism is not the whole topic for the course, but it is a very significant part of it. Now, you know that I have introduced, and you can see my outline here, so there are no secrets. You know, I have taken over, is the correct term, from Mudde and Kaltwasser, the idea of host ideologies. And in our book, uh, we put nationalism and socialism as the two most important host ideologies of populism. Perhaps uh, we were just doing the Islamic Revolution in the other class with Bahare, and perhaps some religious doctrines like Shiite Islam are very convenient host ideologies for populism too. But still, nationalism and socialism are clearly the most important. The question is whether the host ideology concept is adequate to grasp this relationship. In other words, what is the relationship of nation to people in populism? Is it a host? Is it an identity? Or is it a significant overlap of two quite related concepts? If you study this historically, and there's wonderful literature on this, primarily because of of the historiography of nationalism, where you truly have great standard works, uh, Eric Hobsbawm, Seton Watson, Benedict Anderson, Ernst Gellner, and I'm omitting many of the important ones. The Hungarian Jenő Szűcs probably deserves also a mention. Unfortunately, he's not. I don't think he's translated in English, or his pieces on nationalism are not. The piece on Europe's three regions is. So there's great literature on this subject, and of course, the literature which deals with the matter of the nation historically inevitably raises the question of the people. What is the relationship of those two concepts? In some of the literature, the link goes deeper. I was struck by Benedict Anderson's, and to look at books here, it's difficult, but I have that one, Imagined Communities, which I would say is about the first book I would recommend on nationalism if you haven't yet started your study of this important subject, Imagined Communities. Not that it is strong in every respect, not that it's exhaustive in every respect, but conceptually it is an extremely interesting uh, study on uh, pages 5 to 6, if I have this right. He proposes a definition of the nation as an imagined political community and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. That's Benedict Anderson's definition of nation. It can easily be disputed because it is probably the most thorough uh, uh, example, the most consistent example of a purely constructivist idea of uh, of what the nation is. In other words, the nation isn't; it is imagined or constructed by those who speak of it. There's nothing really there before, which is something Anderson doesn't really say because that far almost no one can go. This is paralleled by Ernst Gellner's, I'm not sure now in the notes where I cite him, but I cite him somewhere, Ernst Gellner's definition of the nation, which I had somewhere here, but I don't have it now, where he suggests that instead of the nation being the source of nationalism, it is nationalism that constructs the nation. The very same Gellner, and that's another very standard work on nationalism, namely Nations and Nationalism. I have these books around. I did a lot of studying for today's lecture, by the way. Thanks also to Udipta, who didn't think it was enough and gave me even more to do. But in any case, I was doing a lot already on my own. Gellner does seem to be purely constructivist, but then elsewhere he seems to suggest that construction is one side of the story and the other side is cultural commonalities. But even then, he suggests which aspect of culture is itself a decision. So there are cultural commonalities, uh, obviously, like language, common history, geography, kinship relations, customs, memories. So obviously, there's lots of culture there, right? But which of them is going to become salient for a given nationalism depends on the choice of nationalists. So invention, but not invention ex nihilo, not invention out of nothing, would be the Gellner perspective. And there are others who much more strongly argue for uh, objective cultural meanings which make nationalism or make the invention of the nation or make the reliance on the concept of the nation, if not absolutely necessary, they're all the more plausible, given especially the context in which others are already appealing to the notion of the nation. Let us say, I'm looking at Joanna for a second, I don't know, look around the class. Uh, the Polish notion develops in the revolutionary epoch, in which the nation is already referred to by the French, some extent the Americans, as you will see in my two appendices. So a combination of historical givens, combination of competing ideas and conflicts together give foundation to the notion of the nation. It does, to some extent, depend on how much constructivism one wants to adopt, what the relationship of people and nation will be. For example, in Anderson's definition, which I just mentioned, the distinction between nation and people cannot even be made, right? Uh, well, perhaps the term limited indicates a certain difference, it implies in Anderson that the nation is limited by the fact that there are other nations. Nation is a plurality. But I think that in general, even the way people was imagined in the 18th century, the people, it always implied just that kind of plurality. So, uh, uh, if indeed we adopt a certain constructivist position, then nation and people are identical concepts. If we keep the difference, if we insist on some kind of objective meaning, then uh, uh, the notion of a nation being a possible host rather than a tautological identity could be redeemed. Now, there is a third position, thanks to Eötvös. I have become very conscious of it. And this is the one that Rogers Brubaker expresses in the piece that he sent out. I think he sent it to all of you. I very much doubt anybody had a time to really read it, but I recommend it because it is a very fine essay. There, Brubaker, debating with our friend de Cleen, our other author, suggests that from the outset, there are three meanings of the people, which are relied on those who speak about the people or popular sovereignty in the 18th century. I think he's relying on Margaret Canavan's book The People in making this argument. I have not found my copy of it, and so I wasn't able to check. It must be somewhere. In any case, it's a very fine book also by Margaret Canavan. Brubaker, in any case, on his own, suggests that that people mean plebs or the common people. They mean the sovereign or the demos, and they mean a bounded or distinct entity in the sense of being distinct from other people. In his presentation, it is the bounded and sovereign nature that produces a partial identity or a partial overlap between nation and people. But on the face of it, the idea of people as the common people is one that indicates a fundamental difference. As long as there's a difference, I would argue, the idea of a host ideology can be indeed maintained. But host ideology has some other requirements, not just the requirement that host and parasite, if I can use that term, it's too aggressive, so I shouldn't. But there's no very good term for the counterpart of host. It's not enough for them to be different. It's also important for them to be compatible in structure. In other words, you can pick a host ideology at will, but you cannot really pick one, or you won't, which contradicts essential qualities of the thing that is to be reinforced. We, of course, have host ideologies. Populists refer to host ideologies in terms of reinforcing their appeal on the one side for rhetorical reasons, and I would say for policy reasons, since populism on its own is never historically able to produce policy alternatives, and usually doesn't do it for electoral reasons, because the way to bring together a large variety of demands is better to say as little as possible. Nevertheless, to some people, things have to be said, and that's the function now of the host. In this sense, the parasite can appeal to all, the host will appeal to some militants, and the regime, at least, or if there is going to be a government and a regime, they'll be able to also have some resources for policy making. But in order for any of this to happen, there has to be a compatibility of structures. I try to illustrate this in a debate, I think you remember, with Kevin Olson in the Oxford Handbook, where I suggested that it is authoritarian socialism that has an elective affinity with populism, not Bernstein's socialism. And the reason I argue that is because uh, Bernstein's socialism does not have either a part-whole relationship uh, of the militants to the rest of the people, nor does he have a fundamental antagonism built into the reformist idea. That's the very reformist idea of socialism. You don't have to overthrow, you don't have to destroy the opposing class. You can appeal to them, and you can actually uh, convert some of them to come over to your side. In any case, you can defeat them in ways that are oppositional but not fundamentally antagonistic, as in the case of of uh, of revolution. I don't know if he accepted this because Olson's essay is persuasive in some respects. I go with the Blonky part, not with the Bernstein part, but that's not so important. What is, I think, significant is that in the case of nationalism too, one should be able to detect. One should be able to detect the kind of nationalism that would be uh, an appropriate or likely host for populism. And in that case too, we will see that there is a possible version of nationalism that is less so, or perhaps not at all, depending on the specific formulation. I will refer to civic nationalism and patriotism in this context in the discussion. But before I get to that, I think it's worthwhile to look at the problem of host identity or overlap from the point of view of reconstruction of nation and people historically, following, this is not original work. I follow people like Such and Gellner and many others in making this particular genealogy. I think that, uh, and Margaret Kahneman on the side of the people also is a very important source for this. Uh, I think it is demonstrable in terms of medieval history of ideas that medieval and even ancient history of ideas that the terms uh, nation and people have separate origins. As against the Cleen, however, I would argue that at least initially both are up and down terms. You remember this distinction he makes when he tries to distinguish nation and people uh, between up and down and in and out. Nation is an in and out concept. You're either in it or you're out of it. Those who are out are in another nation, generally. Yeah, of course, there's a discussion whether some things like the Kurds or the Jews are true nations. Uh, but still, even to a German nationalist, there is French nationalism. In other words, there are others outside. This is what Benedict Anderson means by inherently limited. Uh, uh, de Cleen argues, on the other hand, that populism always involves a vertical distinction between elite and people, or between rulers and ruled. And in fact, in terms of their historical origins, I would argue both concepts are up and down. Uh, People, uh, in terms of the Roman tradition and in terms of the society of estates of medieval times, represents a down category. There are three estates, but it is clearly understood that the first two are higher, and they are given different privileges in the society of orders. For example, the first estate members can all participate physically in the meaning of the Estates General, whereas the third estate needs to have representatives for some uh, laws, for some decrees, for some measures of the monarchy. Only the consent of one estate is is necessary, and so on down the line. So it is a hierarchical conception, was always understood that way, and in Rome too, uh, in a way, the Senate and the people, or the plebeian and patrician, was a hierarchical distinction. The Roman Republic was indeed the republic of the Senate and the people, but the Senate had, in fact, anything, the rule of it, the role of a teacher or an advisor or a senior participant in the system. Uh, Conversely, nation is also a hierarchical concept, but in medieval literatures, it refers to the nobility. So initially, both terms are up and down. They're separate. They, if anything, represent two different levels of the society of orders. What is dramatic, and Rogers Brubaker stresses this, is their convergence under the democratic imaginary. This uh, you can see in my appendices, which are at the bottom of my my text. Uh, uh, Not the first one, interestingly, but the second one, the French Declaration, where the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen begins with the representatives of the French people organized as a national assembly. The organized form of the people is national, but it is the same subject in a less or more organized form. And then, after the Declaration begins uh, 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 implying popular sovereignty, then in Article 3 introduces sovereignty as essentially residing in a nation. That's what I have emphasized here in my text, as you can see. So there is, at least in the beginning, a kind of convergence. This would require serious history of ideas to distinguish to what extent that convergence or that identity is held in each of the cases. The US Constitution, which is also in my appendix, doesn't have it that way, uh, nor does the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 39. The US Constitution, people is we the people, the author of the Constitution, whereas the word nation is mentioned only in one place in the Commerce Clause in relationship to other nations. That's already the distinction between the vertical, in that case, the pinnacle of the vertical system is the people and not an aristocracy or the clergy, and the horizontal conception, nation and other nations. The Federalists, to some extent, uh, uh, converges, the Federalist 39 converges with the French notion and treats uh, nation, Federalist 39, as the organized form. Yet it has to make another distinction because the people of the United States, it suggests, are not aggregated uh, in general in that organized form. Or if you want, they exist in two organized form: the nation, says the Federalist, and the states. That's a distinction that will come back especially strongly at the time of the American Civil War. But in any case, the Federalist already has made it, meaning that nation are those capacities of the people which uh, can be treated in terms of simple majority rule or an aggregation, and people can exist in a plural form, namely the peoples of the states. So a kind of distinction between the categories emerges in the American setting more than originally originally in the French. In any case, populism is going to make a significant difference once it emerges as a political option. But I think Brubaker is right. In order for a sharper differentiation between nation and people to begin to play a role, the the idea of the people as underdog, or the people as the common people, has to play a significant role. And with that notion, of course, the possibility of either separation or overlap is maintained. Brubaker, in two tables, one his own and one derived from the Cleen, indicates the separation model and the overlap model. I've not really decided which one I prefer, but for the purposes of our discussion today, either one will serve, because in any case, nationalism has two components of meaning, which will serve to transform the meaning of the people in populism, as long as nationalism is adopted. One is the horizontal issue, but the thing that needs to be said about the horizontal aspect is that it introduces the distinction between domestic and international politics. It is true, you can bring into the horizontal aspect domestic politics. For example, the idea that only some of the people, some of the population, I should say, are part of the nation. This is the discussion of national minorities in a more benign form, and sometimes the foundation of exclusion and racism in the non-benign forms. But the horizontal aspect comes from international relations. It's not domestic as such. When one conceives of the nation as limited, as coexisting with other nations, one is inevitably piggybacking on the state system, on a system of states. And a system of states, even before the nationalist epoch, and more radically in the nationalist epoch, perhaps radicalized by the nationalist epoch, becomes an antagonistic and hostile space. It was always warlike before, but nationalism has made wars much more destructive with respect to civilian populations, with respect to the methods to use in war. Wars of extermination existed historically, but at least in the early modern period of Europe and in other rural settings too, they tended to be absent. Nationalism creates or makes the state system more aggressive, and to the extent that nationalism is then applied, coming now from a reconstructed state system into the domestic setting, involves a greater antagonism. The horizontal relationship is no longer simply a question of in and out. It's one thing to say that Roma are not in the mother nation, for example, or that African Americans are not part of the white nation, as Southerners in the Jim Crow system often understood it. It also means that our relationship to them is like that of states to one another, and it becomes, in this sense, aggressive. And of course, the things are even linked up. They are linked up because In the case of war or competition with other powers, one is tempted to see the nationals of the enemy state, who are perhaps a national minority, as internal antagonists. The friend-enemy relationship, Carl Schmitt's term, is uh, uh, it's not naturally part of nationalism, but becomes part of nationalism in its marriage with the aggressive state system. And once it is brought back to the domestic sphere, it helps create the concept of the internal enemy. Carl Schmitt actually uses that term, internal enemy, and we understand that it is not just the issue of Jews and anti-Semitism in Germany, but it is also a question of national minorities and their loyalty to the state. Think about the Japanese incarceration in the United States. Well, you could say it is racism again, but uh, uh, you can be sure that though not put into concentration camps, Italian Americans and German Americans too were often targets of state and secret service interest during the war. Their loyalty too was certainly put in doubt. Racism, of course, uh, intensifies that internal relationship. So, if indeed logically, if logically the uh, 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 we go with Brubaker and say that some idea of the nation is part and parcel of the notion of the people, that need not be, by definition, the hostile, aggressive, radically antagonistic component. That just happens with the coming together of actual nationalisms and populism. Uh, I want to raise the question, but it is not ultimately such an important part. What I'm trying to say is that it matters for also the adoption of nationalism as a host ideology, whether a nation is constructed or not. Or I think more likely it matters on what basis is it constructed. In other words, uh, assuming that there is construction, but admitting that construction cannot be, as Anderson and Gellner occasionally seem to imply, ex nihilo construction, then it is also a question of on what basis is it constructed. And I would say that though one would consider language to be uh, uh, a particularly problematic form of construction, I think of it as relatively benign. I mean, after all of us can learn any language. So languages can be learned. Now, do we require people to learn language? Do we discriminate on the basis of not? Those are different choices. Just because we make English language of the United States, or now perhaps add Spanish to English in the United States, does not mean that we're being particularly aggressive toward, let us say, Chinese immigrants to the United States. Of course, that distinction can turn into an aggressive one, but I think there are other cultural preconditions. And it does matter to me, I'm not an entirely constructivist in this respect, what kind of memories a nation is constructed on the basis of, what kind of history is it referring back to. French nationalism, in spite of Le Pen, for example, retains primarily its civic character. I know that this has been altered in the Vichy epoch, and I think that right now Le Pen is working hard in ethnicizing it. But still, the civic component, which is inherited from the French Revolution and has been renewed in other French revolutions, remains a pretty significant one. What does a civic component mean? It meant that Germans in Alsace are French. They can become French. Now, yes, there is the linguistic requirement, which of course is not very onerous because they probably either spoke it in the first place or learned it at a fairly easy age. Think about Jewish emancipation, which in France is proposed during the Revolution and eventually accomplished under Napoleon. So, in integration of culturally different peoples is possible under that heading, as long as the civic aspect of the tradition is shared. If the nation, however, is constructed on some other basis than merely language, and especially on the basis of the civic notion, then I think uh, there is certainly a problem. And the issue for populism is which nation concept. Which nation concept is going to be the basis. I mean, the distinction I relied on so far is Hans Kohn, a very old book on nationalism. It's an important book of civic and ethnic. Is civic nationalism the host ideology, or ethnic nationalism the host ideology? In some countries, I would say India. I look around the class, and I always, of course, single out the people who are from the countries which I can illustrate. Sudiptan will know very well. Uh, the nationalism, and we call them the nationalists of Gandhi and Nehru, is indeed civic. Uh, and so civic nationalism is not only possible, but it was hegemonic in the Indian context. Well, it cost Gandhi his life, that he went perhaps too far in the civic direction, and meaning, of course, that there was another option around. Whether ethnic is the right term for that, though, is another question, because I think Hindu nationalism is not entirely or not simply ethnic. Now, of course, uh, 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 there is the complicated factor of caste in the Indian case. That does not exist in all cultures, but in India, there is the question of religion. There is a question of where you are in the religious hierarchy, and indeed there is also the question of language to some extent. But still, the civic conception, which in its radical form wanted to abolish the castes anyway, uh, certainly allowed inclusion, even if it stressed that dimension of the Hindu religion into that religion simply by conversion. So even a religious version of nationalism is a little bit more open than the purely ethnic version. The purely ethnic version, in the end, borders on racism because it suggests uh, that that family descent cannot be altered, uh, uh, and that means that remember these rules. 1/16th rule under National Socialism, it was a 1/8 rule for not being an Aryan, and that's a question of descent. You can add skin color to this too if you actually want to radicalize it. That was not uh, crucial for National Socialism. Not too many Sephardic Jews coming from the Near East were in Central Europe at the time, but you could add skin color even in that case. And of course, that is something that has occasionally played a role also in the Indian case, and plays a role in terms of American and South African and other versions of racism. So you can see that before we really tar and feather nationalism of all kinds under a single brush, we have to kind of make more distinctions than just civic and ethnic. I leave a little bit to the side that which nationalism will be salient in a given setting is depend on also structural matters. One excellent book on nationalism, which is not particularly uh, 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 going to feed into directly into the argument here, is one by John Braley called Nationalism and the State. And Braley points out that the nationalism, and you can see the table, perhaps that's the clearest way of seeing the matter, that nationalism will be very much structured by what it is opposed to. He leaves out official nationalism, he says. I added, so I amended his scheme, and as a result, I get really three categories in both directions, adding up to 9 versions of nationalism, of which 2 are not really not realized. If a nationalism is opposed to a nation, to empires, and I would say that under some conditions, it will easily allow a civic version of nationalism to play a significant role. That is most true, I think, for the separation version, where many of the nationalists were liberal Democrats, at least in the 19th century. I'm not so sure about the Nigerian case, which he adds under this particular setting. The unification nationalists had the difficulty that they required a dramatic strengthening of the state. In other words, you want to separate, you assume that you already have institutions around which you can form a state. If you are a unification nationalist, you are more likely to aim at a dramatic state strengthening. And I think that this has been especially the case for German nationalism, whether in historical German Empire or in the Austrian Empire as well. So you are likely to expect 2 versions of nationalism to emerge from the outset. When opposed to nation states, the likelihood of adopting the civic conception is going to be much lower. I think the reason for this probably is because as against the traditional empires of the Ottoman Empire in the case of Greeks, Habsburg Empire in the case of Hungarians, or the traditional states under which the Germans and the Italians found themselves, as against these relatively weak entities, you're encountering strong states with strong frameworks of integration. And you need an ideology, you need a political position which itself is dramatically state strengthening. And finally, for official nationalism, it is the struggle against alternatives who oppose the state that you want to mobilize the forces of nationalism. And I would say, in that sense, official nationalisms are the most authoritarian version of the host possible. Generally speaking, they come together with convergence. They come together with those forms of populism which are already in power. Now, this scheme is very rough, and perhaps nothing historically determined can emerge from it. The structural positions of even, let us say, just the case that I know the best, of Hungarian nationalists in the Habsburg Empire did imply certainly some possible affinity for liberal nationalism. But, for example, during 1848, 1849, when the various Hungarian nationalists, ethnic groups, came to oppose the project of a Hungarian state, uh, uh, it is was possible for an ethnicized version to emerge. Uh, I cite Benedict Anderson, who Barbara will know this, who cites himself our national poet, Sándor Petőfi, who is certainly a liberal and left-leaning intellectual, but who in one context called the nationalities parasites of the Hungarian nation. Barbara is surprised by this, and I'm surprised too. I was. But we can perhaps look for this. Now, I think my interpretation is, and I would tell Benedict Anderson if I knew him, that this happens not in 1847 or 48 even, but it happens at the time when the Habsburg monarchy was able to mobilize the counter-nationalisms of Croats, Serbs, Romanians against the liberal project in Budapest. Under those conditions, the hostility I would blame the Habsburgs. Easy for me to do that. I would put even Petőfi's language in a way a response, but we don't know, and it would be interesting to look at some biography. Lajos Kossuth, who my other childhood hero, who tried to create a state and failed, turns to federalism in the middle of 20, 30 years after the defeat of the revolution. He was not really a federalist back in 1848, 49, but turned to federalism during the century. In other words, liberalism was strong enough that he could accept the idea of equality with the other ethnic groups. This could have been also realism, because the Habsburg Empire, if it was going to break up, it was going to bury everybody under the wreckage, he probably judged. And you need another alternative to keep it together in some way, and federalism was the answer. Irrespective of what the reason is, he could go both ways, civic and ethnic ways. And I think that in the multinational empires, that tends to be the option. Now, what does it depend on? And I tend to go along with Leah Greenfeld, another important book on nationalism. Leah Greenfeld, where is the book? I can't find it. How is that possible? Well, I can't find it. Oh, here it is. Nationalism, 5 Roads to Modernity, under my papers. Greenfeld tries to consider the cultural, intellectual assumptions which will make people in a difficult situation like that of Kossuth and Petőfi. Sorry for these Hungarian references. Seeing Barbara in the class, I do it. I probably wouldn't do it in a just new school class, because if it means nothing to everybody, then why even refer to it? I'm sure there are good Polish examples of this, by the way, of a civic conception of what the Polish nation should look like. Very serious matter in Poland, which is also, even on its own, the Kingdom of Poland is multinational, so it is a common Hungarian and Polish issue. What will it depend on? What direction a Kosciuszko will define the Polish nation? What will it depend on? And Greenfeld rightly argues that it depends on on normative assumptions, which are some extent uh, uh, independent of nationalism and become fused with it. She stresses in this very interesting book libertarian individualist values and authoritarian collectivist values as the two fundamental differences. And she thinks very, very nicely that not only ethnic nationalism can be uh, uh, structured by such assumptions, but civic nationalism itself can be affected. And she's able to do this because she focuses on the French case. Quite interesting. Her five roads are England, France, England, United States, France, Germany, and Russia. No question that the last two chapters culminate in an ethnic understanding of the nation. But the first three chapters have to face the problem of libertarian individualist values. I think she's being too gentle. I have to reread the book more carefully now if I want to make a judgment. She's being too gentle toward the English and the Americans, who, after all, in colonial settings, were quite able to adopt authoritarian collectivist values, hence racism in many of the cases, ethnic, national forms of exclusion. Any historian of India would be able to certainly tell you that. But in any case, what I'm interested in is the French case, where there clearly is a choice. When Sieyès, in What is the Third Estate, introduces the idea of the French nation, or when the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen introduces the notion of national sovereignty, especially the Declaration links it to an exclusion of all forms of exclusion, let's put it that way, hostility to forms of exclusion. Of course, it doesn't mean you're automatically French. If you are in the territory, you must adopt the values of the Republic. But that anyone can do. Even language is not stressed. And I think there's good reason because of the issue of the Alsatians, probably issue of Basques, Catalans to some extent, and Jews who in the East tended to be Yiddish speakers, and in the Bordeaux, in the West, very often Arabic or Sephardic speakers. So language is not crucial to the French state makers, French constitution makers, I should put it even more exactly, but civic values, acceptance of these values, and in particular respecting the same rights of others is the central matter. So the initial idea is inclusionary. What Greenfeld very nicely, however, adds it is not just an issue of fundamental values. It is also a question of political orientation. Is it individualist or is it collectivist? And she thinks that in France there is a collectivist turn. I usually represent this feature as adopting a notion of the nation or the people, and it is the same for the French revolutionaries early on, whether it can be embodied or non-embodied. So I add embodiment, but you can see how collectivism leads to embodiment. So her idea and mine converge, because if you really do believe of the nation or the people as one, as if it had a single will, then picking an actor who can speak in its name is indeed natural. So it is the Jacobin revolutionary, or if you want, the combination of the civic with the collective, because the Jacobins or Jacobin also never excluded people originally of a foreign language from becoming part of the body of the nation. It's a single body, but you can be included in it. You can be absorbed in it, was their notion. And in this sense, the revolutionary persecutions are not directed against German speakers or about people with different skin color. They're directed against people with political views. Wrongly, most of the time, that's another matter. But in any case, it was a political version of collectivism, which could be embodied in a leadership like that of the Committee of Public Safety or a single individual uh, like Robespierre. So as you can see, uh, even if I don't, I'm skeptical about the British and American inclusion under the civic libertarian notion, civic libertarian individualist notion. As a matter of fact, if you actually look at the ability of the French to include those who adopt French culture and French values, it was greater than in the English or, for that matter, American case. If you actually look at racial differences, so I'm skeptical about her British and American examples, but logically, at least, I agree that libertarian individuals' values, which exclude embodiment, uh, are the basis of a version of civic nationalism, if you want to call it patriotism, which is in its structure non-authoritarian. The linkage, and let me end with this. I have maybe 5 more minutes for this part, but that's enough because the sixth section of this discussion can come next time. For the fifth section, what I'm suggesting then is the inclusion of, I'm sorry, the convergence uh, of authoritarian collectivist embodied forms of nationalism, whether linguistic, cultural, or racially based, with populism that creates an authoritarian synthesis. I go through the steps very quickly. Assuming an original link of nationalism and democracy, once uh, uh, nationalism comes together with populism, that equivalence is going to be lost, as Greenfeld argues. If people are redefined around cultural markers for language, religion, skin color, or lineage, one could add, it inevitably follows that some people will be excluded from the people. So bringing in this version of nationalism by logic means exclusion, or you could reverse it, extrication of the people from the population, or extrication of the people from the people. Uh, this, the mix of populism with the versions of nationalism, which I just mentioned, radicalize the friend enemy concept. Yes, you can have a friend enemy concept between the elite and uh, the plebeians, but under a benign form of nationalism, like a civic version, or if you want internationalism, that opposition can be overcome. You can be part of an elite and become an ideologist, as Marx Engels personally knew, and Gramsci explicitly formulates for the underdog. In other words, uh, uh, the, there is a conflict, there's a class struggle, there is a conflict which democratic populists might register, but this is not a fundamental conflict that must lead to a life and death struggle. Once, however, the fusion of populism and ethno-nationalism or radical nationalism is carried out, then of course the antagonism becomes much more much more violent. Also, the number of animosities changes. Because if standard populism starts off with a two-part model, the marriage with ethno-nationalism creates a three-part model. The two-part model is elite and the underdog. But once you have ethnicity added in the mix, some of the underdogs are not part of the people. That would mean an ethnic minority, a racial minority. It could mean immigrants as well. So, as people have noticed, the left populists tend to find themselves in the context of one antagonism, but now the national populists, let's not call them only left-right, call them national populists, will find themselves with two antagonists, some of whom are potentially even outsiders, because nationalism, of course, also focuses on the horizontal tensions of country and country. So a synthesis of populism and nationalism, an authoritarian synthesis which makes both sides more authoritarian, is indeed possible. My question is it contingent? The Cleen seems to argue that it is contingent because populism need not be fused with nationalism at all. If you define them separately, as in Table 1 of the Brubaker essay, not my tables, but his table, then it matters. It depends on historical settings, what nationalism faces in terms of the structural opposition, as I refer to, whether that marriage is going to be likely in the first place. In Brubaker's case, however, it is not contingent. And then the issue becomes much more radically which nationalism. Well, there are political stakes in this debate. I end with this because I think that if you actually argue that there's an intrinsic relationship of nationalism and populism, and note the relative rarity of civic versions of nationalism historically, the greater power of the ethno-nationalist, cultural nationalist, even racial nationalist versions, then I think the likelihood of that then your suspicion toward populism itself will be greater. If, on the other hand, you think that the stakes, the relationship is contingent, in a way, Brubaker accuses the Cleen of giving a free ride to populism. We can consider populism to be relatively free, and we can go with what Federico Finkelstein demonstrates, and we now increasingly see, is that populism, unlike aggressive nationalism, can be transnational. In that sense, though nationalists create alliances with one another, those alliances are contingent and temporary. They are really for political military purposes, not much more. We see among the populists today much more of a cooperative relationship of populist governments and even ideologists like Stephen Bannon going from country to country and trying to help even build movements in the first place. The nationalists, Italian and German and Japanese, don't build each other's movements. They're already there. And given opposition to the same antagonists, United States, Soviet Russia, and so on, the alliances are natural, but it is based on having the same antagonist. With the populists, you find more of the idea that we are in the same boat. Well, you could say we have the same antagonists. After all, cosmopolitan elites are singled out by almost all of them. But politically, the relations sometimes now tend to be more cooperative. You see this in the left versions of populism more. I was looking for covers for our joint book with Jean, and you find lots of covers in which Orban and Putin are shaking hands, or Bolsonaro and Trump shaking hands. But lots of the Latin American pictures have a lot of people on them. In other words, Morales, Correa, Chavez, even Lula, sometimes even Uribe. In that sense, the Latin American case, the different populists saw each other as involved in a cooperative project. Maybe it comes easy in Latin America because of the linguistic homogeneity. But I think the leftism of most of these populists, I think, plays a significant role. After all, left has been historically internationalist, and this, I think, the left populists also inherit. I stopped with this. I'm sorry I went 5, 10 minutes over, but next time we're going to start with the discussion, so you'll be able to bring in all the points that you want. Okay, who wants to go first? Okay, Adam.
Yeah, I thought this was very good. I have two thoughts. The first is that I think your offhand comment about the lack of a language for the opposite of a host ideology is really smart. I think that this language parasite really limits us. And I wonder if there is something structurally about the idea of host ideologies that prevents us from seeing the way in which populism changes those ideologies as well, and specifically that it's a give and take process, not just a entry, change, stable. The second thought is a bit larger, and this is in a response to your note on memories and the role of them in constructing a sense of nation. I think that this applies in a lot of cases, but I struggled to understand how it applied to two particular cases. The first is Israel and the way in which the nation is imagined as a divinely inspired religious geography that takes it out of the reference of almost everything we see. And the second is post-colonial nations, in which there is a image of the nation that was imposed upon them in the form of the colony that is then sort of shaken off, and then a new particular kind of sovereignty is asserted. But I'm struggling to think that post-colonial sovereignty and non-colonized region sovereignty claims are the same. It seems like those are two, that's a distinction that needs to be made. I'm thinking especially of the way in which somewhere like Haiti sees its national project as so unique and as so distinct from any other nation.
Well, those are excellent points, Adam. The first one, I think I agree with it. In other words, if you choose the Cleen where the two are distinct, vertical against horizontal, up and down, in and out, and then you say that under some conditions they can be joined, then of course you have a perspective which makes what you say, namely a choice of host ideology, a relatively open question. So in that sense, you could just as well choose socialism as you could choose nationalism. And you see this in some cases, not many, I have to kind of admit, with Brubaker, because in Brubaker's perspective, there is no fundamental choice. The only choice there is that what else you're going to add aside from nation for Brubaker, right? Because nation is always in it. So you could choose socialism, but it will be in addition to. So this would mean that Morales, Uribe, Correa got to be nationalists also. What else they are? For Morales, this is complicated by the indigenous question, because Bolivia really has, at the very least, two nations, and their own definition is plurinational. So Bolivian nationalism as a single integrated nationalist imaginary is difficult to achieve, especially because the driving forces of the transition have been often the indigenous themselves. And of course, labor unions, so it was a heterogeneous base. So in that sense, yes, Brubaker has a point that the national, it seems to be always there. It's not absolutely always there, though. Now, even if Brubaker is right, there is a choice. Because, as I try to illustrate, I accuse myself of maybe spending too much time in Hungary, that even in 1848, which is, I don't know if Barbara's attitude to it is the same, we went to school at such different times. Of course, I was completely 1848 is, you know, we all saw each other in terms of March 15th and the Budapest youth, poets and writers and intellectuals who dare to challenge the monarchy and all the rest. So this was really our story. And yet, for the sake of complicating things, I added a line from the greatest hero of that time, which indicates a certain ethnic bias. It's interesting, by the way, that Petrovi, actually his name is Petrovich. So he comes, is it Croat or Serb? I'm not sure now.
I think he's a minority Croat, Bunjevac,
Maybe Croat. So
but it can be a Serb, but the mother, she's a the minority Slovak.
It could be either one because that's even the same language, right? But I think he was minority Croat. It's amazing, right, that this person, I think both his parents are minority, right? And so, yet he's willing to say that the ethnic groups, which probably includes the Croats as well as the Serbs, are parasites. But that's how interesting this is, right? That it is possible for a nationalist to so integrate himself or herself that they identify fully with the prejudices of some of the people who are already there. And you know, it's hard to find in that part of the world people who are ethnically pure anyway, right? Genetic testing wasn't around yet to see what proportion you were of what. But of course, everybody was. Aristocracy less so, because they paid much more attention to marriage. But they tended to be intermarried anyway, initially with Germans. And then, of course, it became even kind of customary to marry Jews, because that was economically a really good move, it was thought by aristocrats. But in any case, you see my point, that even in a case like that, which is a very liberal civic version of nationalism in almost all accounts, at least initially, the ambivalence comes in. And so there is a choice. If the Cleen is right, there is a choice between host ideologies altogether. If Brubaker is right, then there is a choice between a version of nationalism. Does any nationalism not have the civic component? Well, it's possible that it is absent. But I think, for example, one version of really ethnic nationalism, Russian, which is often even pointed to, even using the term Russification, as Benedict Anderson used the term Russification for official nationalism. By the way, we have Magyarization too in Hungary. So the idea of Hungarianizing nationalities is something that we had. When it comes to memories, even the Russian nationalists have the Decembrists, have a liberal tradition that they can look back to. So there may always be a choice. Certainly India, which I tried to use before, has a fantastic choice because great founders are connected with the different versions of Indian nationalism, and that becomes a choice. And I think it is a choice for Poland, for Hungary, for Russia, and for all the countries. But of course, and this is what I have not analyzed well, trying to bring together the Breuil scheme and the Greenfeld scheme, what should be analyzed is the historical context within these choices are made. I gave Hungarian Civic a free ride by suggesting that the Austrians put up the ethnic groups. That's the way we learned it in school anyway. I don't know if Barbara learned it in school that way. Of course, always is a hero, an anti-hero on the other side. It is the Croatian Ban Jelosic, who is, you know, who that is, right, Barbara? Jelosic was the organizer of pogroms against Hungarians in the South. This is the way we learned it in school. So there's always somebody, you know, sometimes associated with the church, and you have anti-heroes in the Indian tradition too. I'm sure Congress has its anti-heroes. Of the assassins of Gandhi have been their anti-heroes, and of course on the other side, I am sure that the idea, well, Gandhi is killed. You can see how serious this matter was to the Hindu nationalists. So this question of a choice is important, and I'm emphasizing it, as you'll see in the discussion next week, because we're not going to banish nationalism from the world. You know, this I'm getting from Colin Crouch. I'm losing a little bit my copy of Backlash, where this is argued in particular. I assigned it, but I can't find it. But the idea that you're going to just banish nationalism in the name of some internationalism. Of course, this was the Marxist idea, right? Marxist-Leninists believed that and created national communisms all over the place in the end. Think about Ceausescu. Think about a little bit even Kadarism, which flirts with nationalism to some extent. And Stalin surely did, because in the war you had to mobilize great Russian nationalism against the enemy. So in that sense, the idea of banishing nationalism has been tried and has not succeeded. So I emphasize the element of choice, because that's pretty much to build in a non-populist alternative, democratic alternative, you have to take nationalism as a presence. And there are good reasons for that, by the way. The literature discusses the appeal of nationalism, why nationalism appeals, is not just a question of having an enemy we all want to kill. That's the hate side, the aggressive side of nationalism. But there is the love side too. You know, when Anderson says, imagine community, he does not mean to say that community is a negative term. And we know that modern society destroys a lot of community, right? It destroys village communities, destroys or weakens kinship communities. It weakens historical forms of association of all kinds, guilds, corporations, entities. Religion too, secularization, has a decommunizing aspect, right? You know, you go to church with the same people all the time, knowing that some other people are going to church all the time in the next village, is a community building dimension. When this weakens and people write books, search for community, that search is on. And nationalism tries to imagine alternative forms of community. And that's a powerful idea. It's a love idea. It's a libidinal idea. It's not based on, if you want to go with Freud, it's not based on the aggressive instinct. It is based on the libidinal instinct. And so in this sense, an alternative to nationalism, well, socialism is an alternative in one possible scheme. It too has a community building aspect. But within nationalism, there are options for versions of community and communality which are positive. And there are degrees of negativity also. It's interesting, when the aggressive aspect dominates, the love aspect is diminished. So, yeah, Adam is not sure. I'm not either. I'm not sure.
Well,
I'm not sure because, on the other hand, even in the context of a defeated war, uh, the Germans fought on. I mean, after Stalingrad or after the liberation of France in the west, Hungary to the east, and all the rest, the fate of the Reich was sealed. Yet they fight on. Well, of course, the hatred of the enemy could be strong enough, or the fear of the enemy could be strong enough. What the enemy will do to us, given what we have done. I'm putting this in psychoanalytic terms. Probably no people didn't think of it that way. But in any case, you can see that it has two powerful forces, two powerful depth psychological dimensions. And in order to diminish one, it would seem that we need to increase the other. Can we do it? Well, Freud was very skeptical. Anybody else? You see, Adam, your two questions led to a very long discussion, but that's what questions do, and I think that's why I want to mobilize all of you for next session to really raise issues and questions. Anybody else? Well, there is indeed time, and I did leave a section out. Probably I've said pretty much all these things already, but if this is something to discuss, especially for next time. If we are thinking of a democratic alternative, the big choice will be, is it going to be left populism or is it going to be something else? That's what the debate is these days, at least among people like us in the New School and other similar places. And the question is, how much freedom is there in making choices? Often people adopt a purely individual libertarian position because they think that with nationalism and with socialism, there is no choice. Each one on its own leads to authoritarianism. Right? And if you're an individualist libertarian or an anarchist on the left, right-wing libertarian on the right, there will be a lot of historical ammunition to support your position. Look what the nationalists do when they are fully in power. Right? You mentioned, I left this out. Yeah, you see, good. If I keep on talking, eventually I remember the rest of the question. And you mentioned post-colonial, right? And I left that out from my answer. Well, in post-colonial settings, in a way, in almost all of them, there is significant ethnic difference. That is even true for the US post-colony, where significant religious differences between North and South. There are French-speaking minorities in the South. And then, of course, as the thing expands, Spanish-speaking groups and so on, others are brought in. In general, this is more true. And it is more true because the colonial conquests are at the expense of empires. And empires are multinational to begin with. And when a colonial power conquers them, precisely because of its own ethno-nationalist. You can call it civic if you want, but I think some level ethno-nationalist bias doesn't want to integrate the groups that it has conquered. Yet it wants to control them. Adam, and that I think is the basis of the answer to your question, because not integrating, so you have a kind of civic thing present. After all, the English in India established institutions which are by that time increasingly civic, representative government, for example, responsible government. These things are introduced. Nevertheless, they are introduced for a very small segment of the population, and even for them, in a way that is ultimately dependent on the colonial power. But there are other groups, and there is no desire to fully integrate their great variety at different levels of political development and consciousness. Moreover, controlling them becomes easier and more plausible if they are kept separate. We make up this idea of divide and conquer for the colonial empires, but undoubtedly they were there for historical empires too. If you think about, for example, the Ottoman one, it keeps its minorities in millets and self-governing entities, and there's an element of this in India as well, under British rule. The different religious groups, Victor, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, do preserve their jurisdiction in family law, in certain religious and ritualistic practices. So existing divisions are there under the older empires, and they are kept by the colonial. This means that on the eve of independence, there is both the nationalism of the colonial people as a whole against the outsider, and an internal ethnic division of the colonial peoples who have been kept divided by the colonial power and who had historical divisions even before that. I don't buy the idea, I don't know about Eötvös thinks, which at some point in the age of constructionism was very prevalent. Nick Dirks, for example, represented this view for India, that the English kind of create the caste system. Have you ever heard that, Eötvös? It's a very questionable notion because there are some legal provisions which may rigidify it under colonial rule.
I think that's the claim.
What? But
that's the claim, that it sort of bureaucratizes caste and makes it administrative.
Hardens it, and by bringing in Western law codification, it becomes even harder. That's perhaps the real argument, right? But nevertheless, it's there. And the nationalist movement inherits it. Now, just look at this amazing history of India in the 20th century. This is a constant struggle within the nationalist movement, a constant struggle of Indian nationalism against ethno-linguistic, religious nationalist forms. I already spoke about this, speaking about assassination of Gandhi. But it is there, and it is one that is extremely difficult to handle. It was very important for Congress to have important Muslim leaders within the leadership of the party. And nonetheless, from Jinnah's point of view, Congress was ultimately a Hindu organization. Now, this was self-serving for him because he could organize on an alternative basis. He himself is a pretty secular guy, and he did not really value a strongly religious-based nationalism. And yet, for him, it became a vehicle, and he builds on it. So in that sense, decolonization means a inevitable struggle of the liberation movement, which in order to unify itself becomes civic. We shouldn't even attribute good intentions to either side. Civicness for Nehru was a force. He could use civic nationalism as a weapon against the colonial occupier. Now, he was, of course, religiously pretty secular, right? And so in that sense, it comes easy to him. He's upper caste. Gandhi is not even. So in that sense, their attitude to caste is both principled and to some extent, Gandhi, on religious grounds, could not accept caste anyhow, because he had his own religious views. But in any case, civic nationalism comes naturally on that side. At the same time, the alternative is also growing. And I think this is Adam's question, right? That the two enter into conflict at the moment of decolonization. And the post-colonial regime, post-colonial government inherits it. And, you know, I had Igbo nationalism on the board, Nigerian nationalism, Igbo nationalism. So at least in that African case, the conflict came to a civil war. But in India, it came to a very bloody confrontation in the moment of independence also. And then, of course, subsequent wars of India and Pakistan, and then Pakistan and Bangladesh. So, you know, the thing continues and is not easy to resolve. But I think that if you look at European nationalisms, the same tensions are also there. But it's not just a function of colonial rule. Well, you could say Austro-Hungary is an empire, very weak one. In that sense, Hungary is pretty much governed by Hungarians through a significant part of the dual monarchy. But in any case, a weak empire is still an empire. And so during 1848, the War of Independence, the empire, like the British, helped reinforce ethno-nationalisms in the plural. And, you know, I just don't know the history anymore well enough to know if this is entirely general. 4 points east from France. And the English and the French, of course, encountered a problem in the colonies. Is it an equal problem in the metropole? Well, we do have Scottish, Irish. Yes, the Irish become the problem in the metropole for the Brits. Yeah, of course, it is a problem in the metropolitan Britain as well, because the Irish refused the idea that they have been just incorporated in a single civic nation of what? Controlled by the British upper class. Yes, but in any case, it wasn't just a class matter. And their language actually disappears, or almost disappears, on the verge of disappearing. And the religious issue. So it is true toward points west also. And yeah, if you examine French history, I'm sure we'll find examples. But in the colony, France plays out the same struggle in Algeria. Wants to introduce civic Frenchness into Algeria. And so this means that if you give up your historical memories, your religion, you can become fully French. Very few Muslims choose this. Many more Jews in Algeria choose this option in terms of percentages. But in any case, once many do not choose the option, the conflict reappears. Anybody else? Adam, you can ask another one.
I have two thoughts. The first is responding to your notes on colonization. As you were talking about it, specifically the Algerian case, it became very clear that you're thinking about this in terms of they choose French civic identity or Algerian civic identity. But it seems like in the cases of so many colonized nations, we have the emergence of hybrid identities in which Algerian identity is necessarily French, French identity is necessarily Algerian. So does that mean that those nationalisms now introduce a third element where an Algerian nationalism can claim a French Algerian identity, or must a French national, or must a Algerian nationalism exclusively claim Algerian national identity without any remnant of French identity? The second question, which is very different, as you use the, we talked about Freud, use the language of choice, but I've been reading Freud's group psychology again for the final paper. And one key note that Leclau just entirely does away with is Freud's emphasis on hypnosis, on the power in which love completely takes over the subject and they are unable to make these choices anymore. So I wanted to sort of hear your thoughts on reformulating the question of choosing between nationalism, choosing between host ideologies, as instead something much closer to feeling compelled as though this is the only viable option, feeling as though one cannot even begin to question if there would be another approach. Or does that fall too far away from your way of thinking about this?
Well, the second one is too difficult for me because I really don't do too much social psychology. And though, you know, I read these texts also of Leclau, but not the ones he refers to, you know, it's very hard for me to actually make up my mind. So I tend to be sociologistic, which is why I brought in, but very badly, I have to say, the scheme from Breuil, namely to indicate the different historical contexts in which this happened. Opposed empires, and indeed we could now add another category, help with Adam's help, opposed to colonial as against land-based empires, which actually have different role, different possible role. I'm not entirely sure if I really have good structural answers to the question that you raised, but I'm not the one to give the good psychoanalytic or psychological answer either, because this is not certainly not my strength. I would always, on my own, prefer people who are choosing for reasons of love and community than people who choose make choices on the basis of their hatreds. But you know, am I that kind of person? You know, you have to kind of understand yourself. And I probably have too many conflicts with people to be entirely an Eros type guy and not a Thanatos type guy to some extent. To what extent this works for people in different settings and so on. No, it's clear that you have remarkable people like Gandhi who choose Eros without any reservation. But then he never exercises state power. I had Sándor Petőfi was my example here. I mean, I'm sure he's an Eros guy. He has many, many love poems. Bar will know them. He's really writing beautiful poem about his mother. I remember it still even, I learned it at age 11 or 10. I could begin it, but I'm not going to trouble you with my reciting poetry, which is a Hungarian thing, by the way. We always did that. I don't know if they still do it now. So he's a love guy, and yet he calls them parasites. Interesting, right? So a kind of structural tension, which is not his own production, sort of maneuvers him into a position where he allows his inner Thanatos, right, to go with Freud. I think that the Breuil scheme should tell us the kind of something about the tensions that exist, but I'm not sure if he has linked together, because you have to read the whole book. I haven't reviewed it for this time. Your other question, I think, though, I can answer better. And my answer unequivocally, yes. Udipta can, from Indian point of view, address this. I think that when you are constructing a collective identity or self, you cannot avoid taking in your history, all of your history. And especially when that history has left institutional traces which are normatively defensible. So in that sense, the colonial powers influence historically is going to be part of you, and that would be true in either side. I think I illustrated that even, that the civic nationalism, you could say, it's a bit of an imitation of British civic nationalism. I mean, after all, Nehru spent a lot of time in England, educated to the bar, takes over the values of the British legal profession. And Gandhi too was actually so educated. So on some level, this enters in, right? But it enters in for the nationalists too, because the nationalists or the ethno-nationalists build on the kind of antagonisms which are also fostered by the colonial power. So no one can remain free of it. I can't say anything about Algerian nationalism and Algerian politics because I'd have to study it. But I think it's a general point. Yes, they remain French. It's impossible not to be. It's impossible not to be after so many years. Now, of course, there are always people who loudly announce freedom from all that, who say we're gonna purify ourselves from everything that an imperial or colonial or external power has put into us. But you know, it's futile if you look at India, Canada, many African countries. Now, of course, dictatorships emerge, and it's not that the Brits left a heritage of dictatorship in place, although one could argue that the colonial power was like a collective dictator in many settings. So martial law, emergency government can be then adopted by even dictatorships. In this sense, I think that to the extent that historical memories and historical patterns become parts of what constitutes a modern nation, we're dealing with something, I think, pretty much unavoidable, even if it looks very un-British or un-French of what the revolutionaries then do. Because even those dimensions can come from the underside of the colonial heritage. Of course, they really do discover older histories and integrate them. So I don't suggest that the post-colonial is simply a product of the colonial, but it's part of the mix. Okay, I think it's time. Now, you know, Adam today played a role for everybody. And I don't want to discourage him, but I want to encourage everybody else. And so for next time, you're going to have to begin with your questions. And given the fact that I again assigned a piece by me, they can be very critical and hostile questions. That's fine. Okay. So see you next time.